Hello everyone. This learning module accompanies this video accompanies the learning module on class issues and education in the South. I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about Marxism, because Marxism played a big role in some of the changes we begin seeing in the 19th century. Marxism is a philosophy. It's an educational philosophy, economic philosophy, political philosophy. That's what we call a meta-narrative, in the sense that it's a way of looking at the world in a really holistic, complex, complicated way. And the basic principles behind Marxism is they believe that educational change, in fact all social change, is driven by power struggles between groups in terms of controlling power, particularly who controls, owns means of production. So Marxists tend to look at social reproduction in a negative light. Other philosophical perspectives would look at social reproduction in a positive, in the sense that it promotes stability. Marxists look at it as a negative because they believe it perpetuates injustices that are built into the system, particularly continued domination of one class over another. So it's important to understand the essence of Marxism is that it's rooted in conflict between classes. During the 1800s, we begin to see a lot of changes in terms of social, economic structure, particularly control of large amounts of wealth by relatively few people. Up until the 1700s, or through much of the 1700s, wealth was distributed more or less evenly across the population. There were still some individuals who were extremely wealthy. George Washington was considered probably one of the wealthiest people in the colonies during his lifetime. But it wasn't congregated. That wealth wasn't congregated in the hands of a small number of people the way it was in the 1800s. This is largely due to control over the mechanization process and modernization. The factory systems, mass production, mechanics, textiles. But with the shift in wealth, with a relatively few number of people controlling extraordinary wealth, class distinctions became more apparent, and lower segments of society became more resentful as they began to watch upper classes move farther and farther ahead while they stayed in the same place. And this is development of what Marxists refer to as class consciousness, the idea that as a member of a class one is different from other people, depending on where one stands. A lot of this tension, this class conflict, gave rise to a political party known as the Working Men's Party, and they were active much of the early 1800s, but particularly active in education from 1827 to 1835. They began in Philadelphia. One of their principles, part of their what you call political platform, was trying to find public support for public education. They were very critical of charity schools, found them to be inadequate, poor quality, underfunded. They wanted to try and persuade people to use tax as a basis for supporting education. One of the things they did was rely on social science research in order to try and make their case. They commissioned a study in New York City in 1827 to examine the state of charity schools. Plenty of evidence to find that they were very poor quality, lacked funding, and curriculum maintained class differences by preparing children to largely be workers, part of the factory system. So educational reform was really central as a part of their platform. And they shared a lot of the same educational philosophy as people we've discussed others, Horace Mann, for example. Their goal, they looked at public education as a way of protecting people from economic exploitation. They looked at education as a way of gaining political, economic power. Now, for us nowadays, we think of this as common sense. Get an education in order to succeed, better earning, better lifestyle. They recognized very early on to connect, make a real clear connection between education and economic opportunity, and how inadequate education led to unequal opportunities. They believed that knowledge was power in an industrial society, and that knowledge was one of the best ways of preventing the masses by being dominated by a small group of people who controlled the capital, the money, and the means to production. So you look at it, you can see a lot of what we would later call Marxist influence in the Working Men's Party. They were motivated very much by a sense of distrust, resentment toward the upper classes, and this is a classic example of class conflict. But the reformers, Working Men's Party and other reformers, stressed the role of education in protecting democratic rights, as well as in the long term to maintain some harmony. They stressed education as a way of sharing power. With regard to crime and poverty, both the Working Men's Party reformers had similar faith in schools. They both felt common schools would lead to a decrease in crime and the poverty rate, which is very common sense, and there's 150 years of social science research to support that. The reformers wanted common schools to reduce conflict between capital, people who controlled money, means to production, and labor. And the Working Men's Party wanted to ensure that capital did not maintain a monopoly over knowledge. They had a very keen awareness of how knowledge is power. Some of their ideas, however, went too far. They really subscribed to some what we would call more militant Marxist thinking. One example of this was what they called the guardianship plan. They believed that educational opportunity could not take place on an equal level if one child went home to impoverishment and the other went home to a life of affluence. And there is some very persuasive truth in that, and a lot of social science research that supports that. Their solution, and I think most of us would agree this is far too extreme for most people to accept. They wanted to take children from families, place them in boarding schools, separate the children from the families, and they would all receive equal treatment, food, clothing, and education. As you can probably understand, that idea turned a lot of people off to the Working Men's Party and began to defect, and the Working Men's Party eventually ceased to exist. Education in the South, the other area we're looking at this week, that is particularly problematic. To understand educational change in education in the South, one has to understand the social structure in antebellum South. By antebellum meaning before the Civil War. Population of the South was approximately 12 million in 1850. About 8 million were white, about 4 million were slaves. Of the white population, of that 8 million, approximately 300,000 were wealthy landowners. Most of the others, 6.7 million roughly, were small farmers with only 1 to 2 acres of land, what we would call subsistence farming, meaning they produced only enough to really provide for their family. They might produce more in a good year, they might not, but they really were there primarily just to have enough land to support their own family. And approximately 1 million Southerners, freed Southerners, were poor and really on the bottom of the social structure, not owning any land, for example. The South reacted particularly negatively to the idea of public school taxation. The Southern idea was that privilege of government should go exclusively to those who were intelligent, educated members of the upper class. Most perceived the role of the middle lower classes to support the upper class in their management of government. which they often did. Keep in mind, caste class distinctions were not rigid, except for, of course, one group, slaves. But all of this influenced Southern attitude toward education. The upper class educated their children largely to prepare them for their station in life, and to protect their station in life, their family and economics. The farmers had very little access to schools. Would have been primarily private schools in which people paid. So for most families, that was not an option. States had some provisions for indigent families, but in rural areas, and keep in mind that the South at the time was largely an agrarian society, most poor families had no nearby access to such programs, so children often grew up without any kind of education. And of course, there were no provisions for education for slaves, except what they would need to know in order to work their jobs, work on plantations, etc. There was a strong opposition to the education of slaves. And pretty obvious, the greatest fear was a fear of slave uprising, fear of being able to communicate with other groups. And bear in mind, as we talked about a minute ago, population was largely 12 million, 8 million of them were white, 4 million were slaves. So there was a tremendous fear in the South of slave uprisings, and there were quite a few, and some of them were quite bloody. So the idea of a tax-supported public education really directly contradicted Southern attitudes. Upper classes did not want their children to mingle with the middle classes or the lower classes. And it wasn't until Reconstruction, the period following the Civil War, did any meaningful educational reform occur in the sense representative of what was taking place in the South. So most pressure for educational reform in southern states came from the North, and in many cases was imposed on it, and justifiably in the best interests of the citizens, by Congress and Reconstruction, in many cases with very active resistance on the part of Southern leadership. So that sets up a kind of social picture, social structure. As usual, I'll be around. If you have any questions, please get in touch with me. If I'm not at the office, I'm certainly able to check in with my computer. That's about it for now. Have a good week. I'll be in touch, everyone. Bye.